Hello, my name is Jeremy, and today I'm going to be making a list of my top board games of 2018. I do video reviews, and I presented a list like this last year. I found that to be a pretty enjoyable process for myself, just kind of looking back at what I played over the course of the year, and then doing some, arbitrary ranking of that. There were things I hadn't played yet. Typical disclaimers apply, of course, in doing anything like this, but by and large, I found it to be an enjoyable process just to, reminisce about what I had enjoyed over the previous year. And I figured I'd do that again for 2018. I guess I would just, generally preface that by saying that 2018 for me was not necessarily a banner year for board games, insofar as there weren't, for me, any, I think, earth-shattering titles. Some years you get maybe one or two of those. There wasn't anything that really made me think about the hobby in a new light or what have you. But that being said, I think that this was a year in which the average quality of the average game that I played or that I bought this year was really quite high. Not necessarily, best games, not necessarily the most original games I ever played, but generally when I bought a board game this year, I was happy with what I got as a product. There were a few exceptions to that. There were a few games that, other people I know have enjoyed that maybe didn't hit with me. Off the top of my head, maybe I would say something like Space Base, which to me is just like Machi Koro all over again, not my kind of thing. Maybe another one would be like Chronicles of Crime, which sounds interesting in practice, or in theory, but in practice it's really just sitting around with a group of people scanning small QR codes and then reading off of a phone. Not necessarily a worthy successor to some of my favorite games of the hobby, like the Sherlock Holmes games. To me, it's just, a pale imitation of what I enjoyed about those games. Maybe it might be interesting as a solo exercise, but not my kind of thing. But, I mean, that's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about the best of the year, not what I was disappointed by. And like I was saying, I thought there was maybe not as much innovation as I might have hoped for the year. Maybe not anything that really blew me out of the water. And as I was coming up with a list, I came to realize that a lot of my favorite things from this year were actually, twists on old games that I really enjoyed. Whether that took the form of a reprint, an expansion that radically changed the nature of the game, or a new edition with maybe a retheming, maybe not. So, or just a small twist on rules to what was largely the same game system. And when I first made my first draft of my list, I ended up with a top 10 list that had at least more than half of the games, with very clear predecessors from the same designer, just tweaked an old design and put out a new version of some sort, whether that took the form of a new expansion, new reprinting, or what have you. And I didn't want to release a top 10 list that just had old games essentially on it. So I took it upon myself to divide my list this year into two lists, and I have a list essentially of games that are, I'll just broadly say, re-implementations, whether again that takes the form of an expansion or reprinting or retheming or what have you. And then I have a list of, we'll just say original games, which, that's in the eye of the beholder, of course, but I broadly group them into those two categories just so I could note what were truly some of my favorite games of the year without just falling back on what felt like old favorites in a lot of cases. So I guess I will begin with all that preamble out of the way, and I'll start by, before I start my little listing of my expansions or re-implementations, I'll mention that one game that I didn't include on this list, which probably deserved to be there, was the reprinting of Endeavor, Endeavor Age of Sail. That's a really solid Euro game that I enjoy a lot, with played nicely at 5 players in the old version, but now they've given it 2 maps. I've played on those 2 maps, but I haven't played with the expansion content that they've included in it. Because I haven't done that, I felt it wasn't really fair to include that on my list, even though it's a really lovely reprinting. It was a nicely produced game to begin with. They've taken that up a notch, I think, and I'm sure if I got around to trying the new content, I would have included on my list. Although I will say that the one rule change that they did make, which allows you to get into other territories before they're opened, is a fantastic rule. I like that rule a lot. So maybe I should have just included it on the list. But in any case, we'll call that an honorable mention, and I'll go on to my list. So I've actually printed out. I have 15 games, which sounds like a lot, but I'll try to be relatively brief as I go through these. 15 games on each of the two lists, and I'll just start. So we'll start again with my re-implementations list to begin with. So the number 15, I have the 5 and 6 player expansion for Sagrada. I should note that Sagrada was a game that I was not especially enamored with, but this somewhat clumsily named 5 and 6 player expansion for Sagrada adds a private dice pool in which players are going to have to draft. It's a dice drafting game if you haven't played it. Players in the original game would have to draft 2 dice each turn from a collective pool of dice, and you were essentially at the mercy of what got pulled out of the bag. Now they've added, essentially in this 5 and 6 player expansion, even if you're not playing with 5 and 6 players, they've added a personal pool of dice where you have 2 of every color that you can use from the start of the game. It adds a lot of strategy to a game that was, to me, way too dependent upon the luck of the draw. And to me, it makes it a really great light to medium weight game. Whereas I've had a pretty mixed to negative opinion of it before. It's just one of these things that just radically changes the game with one small rule tweak. Well, it's one major rule tweak, actually. The small rule tweak that they also included in this expansion was in the base game you got personal goal cards, which were all simply have the most, or get points for your red dice, or get points for your yellow dice. It became very obvious what players were trying to collect over the course of the game as they were drafting. It became very easy to block. It just wasn't an interesting secret scoring method. So now they've changed those cards out in this expansion, again the 5 and 6 player expansion, with cards that now let you score for values that you have in a given pattern. So it's a lot harder to see what other people are doing, but still for you is going to give you some extra angst as you're placing pieces into your area. So maybe it's slightly less interactive in this regard, but it's more of a puzzle, less about just trying to get the same color die every time. So that's essentially a redemption of a game that I was mixed on to begin with. That's the Sagrada 5 and 6 player expansion at number 15. Moving on, number 14, I have a game from Queen Games. It's pretty much a reprinting, although it has some new rules, and mostly in the form of small expansions that came with it, and that is Franchise. This is a re-implementation or re-theming and reprinting of an older game by the name of Medieval Merchant. It's an area control game in which players are trying to spread out various franchises of hotels or fast food chains or whatever on a pretty garish United States map. And essentially it's a route building game with 2-level area control in it. I generally like area control games, and this one flows really well. Has a nice cadence to it. It has a really light rule set, and it's largely going to be about managing some very tight money, which is so there's every turn you're making, you feel like you have meaningful decisions, and there's a question of can you get into an area and maybe get second place with only 1 or 2 cubes, that sort of thing. So it's a very dry, I would say, cube pusher, but it's my kind of game. It's a throwback to an old classic style Euro. That's my kind of game as well. So it's one that I would recommend. I feel like it hasn't gotten much notice, possibly because it is a reprint and people already knew what it was. But it's a game that I've enjoyed the times I've played it. That is Franchise. So number 13 is a game called Good Critters. This is a retheming of a German game that I have played by the name of, I believe it's Taifetaschen. And this is a negotiation game that plays really relatively quickly. It has very quick rounds, but there's a lot of them, in which players are going to be playing mobsters in this somewhat weird retheming your mobster animals. That's another rethemed game of this year, Mafioso, which is a retheming of Louis XIV, another really decent game. Also has mobster animals. I'm not sure what that is. I guess it just makes violence cuddly. I have no idea. But in any case, this is a retheming of this German game, which was essentially about grift in corporate setting, rethemed into a mobster animal setting, and it is essentially a negotiation game in which one player is going to be a boss, collect a number of cards, which is dependent upon the number of players, divide them among the table, 2 players, and then players are going to essentially vote yes or no if they accept that, or they want to try to overthrow the boss. There's also some actions where players are going to be able to steal from other players, or just draw from the top of the deck and just pocket some loot, essentially do some embezzlement. And the way that these dynamics play out is really fun and light as negotiations games go, and it almost veers towards being a party game because of how nice and smoothly it flows. Players have these little pawns which are going to put in front of another player, just to essentially threaten them with the chance that they may or may not be stolen from, and that will cause players to shift their actions. And it's just a game that is highly interactive, very well implemented in its new version. Although I have to say that I did like the old theme of people being corrupt in a business better. I'm not sure why that didn't translate over. I think that's a more understandable theme than furry mobster animals, but in any case, I think that's a game that I'm happy to see finally get a US printing, and it's one that I would recommend. That is Good Critters. Moving on, number 12, I have Azul, the Stainglass of Sintra. I will say that last year, Azul was my number 1 game of the year, so this being at number 12 means that this was somewhat of a disappointment for me. I mean, it's still on my favorite game list for the year. I still like the game, but at the same time, I think it's considerably less of a good game than Azul was. I think that, which again, this is an extremely high bar. I don't want to sound like I'm down on the game. I'd still happily play it. I just would prefer the original. This one just feels a little bit to me, more luck driven, because essentially there's a random setup of your tiles. You may or may not have colors present on that, so you could get hit hard as a result of that, with sometimes very little way to mitigate that. But it has the same central drafting mechanism from Azul, which works well here. It's still terrific to play that. I think some of the scoring decisions that you make are clever. Essentially, you'll score one. If your grid is set up from left to right, if you score on the right and then you layer score on the left, the right columns will score again. So that creates a neat incentive structure. I just find it a little bit fiddly. The way that you have to flip your little tiles over, it just, to me, loses some of the elegance that was what I really responded to in the normal Azul. But again, the basic core of the game is identical. It still works really well. It's almost more of a variation for Azul. If this was an expansion for Azul, I wouldn't be over the moon for it. But I still think it's one of the better games of the year. Just one that I think doesn't hit the amazing heights of Azul, which is a game that I think we'll still be playing 10 years from now. This does not kick that one out the door by any means for me. But still a game that I enjoy. Still one that I would recommend trying. Moving on. Number 11, I have, actually, I guess an expansion map, although my version's a full copy, so we might want to call it a spin-off, and that is Concordia Venus. This is a follow-up to the very popular, I guess, how would you call it, economic game, hand management game, Concordia, and this is more than just another expansion map. It adds a team element to it, so it could play at 2, 4, well, I guess not really at 2, at 4 or 6 players. I will say it runs a little long at 6 players. You might want to have limited discussion if you're playing with 6, because the game could take 3 hours to do that, in my experience, which slightly outstays its welcome. But in any case, it very seamlessly incorporates team play into a game that didn't seem in any regard designed for it from the get-go. Essentially, a few cards get modified in the deck, so now some of them change how you interact with your partner. And partners essentially sit in staggered positions around the board. So whenever a partner generally plays a card, though, you'll also do that action. So whereas Concordia is a game about ruthless efficiency, just doing whatever's best for you at every moment and trying to, eke out points here and there to stay ahead of the curve. Now, having a teammate to worry about when you're going to play your action, you don't just have to worry that it's the best action for you at the time. You have to worry that your partner is also going to benefit from it because your scores are going to get added together at the end of the game. So it's a very clean rule set for how it transforms it into a team game, and it works surprisingly well. I've really enjoyed it every time I've played it, and at its core, it's a really terrific game. So that is Concordia Venus. Very highly recommended. So moving on, my number 10 re-implementation, if we want to call it that, of the year, is of a game that I guess caused a little bit of a buzz a few years ago. It was, I believe, Spiel des Jahres nominated. It was The Game, and this is the two-player implementation of that, which I believe came out at SN last year. I didn't play it till this year. There might be a few games on this list that hit that category. It might be 2017 games that I'm putting on my 2018 list. But this is The Game face-to-face. This is a two-player only version of that, and whereas The Game was a cooperative exercise where players were trying to play cards essentially in as close to sequential order, either ascending or descending, onto piles collectively, the two-player version of the game has you, as it's called, face-to-face, working on your own individual pile. So you'll draw a number of cards, try to play as many as you can onto your board without skipping too many numbers in between, and then you'll draw back up. The thing that makes the game work is that as your opponents have piles, if you give them a card that benefits them, so for example, if they're on their pile that's counting downward, you play a card that's higher, which helps them out so they have more potential plays on that pile, that allows you to get more cards back when you're refilling your hand. So you have to do that every once in a while. Also, it's a way to get cards out of your hand more quickly because there are two game end conditions. The first is that you can't make a play, so if you can't play on your pile at least one card during a round, you'll lose and the game will end and your opponent will win. But also, if you race through your deck more quickly than your opponent and you get every card played, you'll also win. So there's this real tension between getting cards played, which again might entail making it easier for your opponent, and just trying to keep your plays as long as possible in case you draw poorly. And it works very well. It's almost like the flip of like the Concordia thing. It wasn't at all designed as a competitive game, but it works extremely well as a competitive game. It's surprisingly enjoyable, one that I've played a lot over the last year. It's two-player only game, but to me it's a better version than the original of The Game. So that's The Game face-to-face. Alright, I'll try to speed things up as I go, just because I don't want this to run too long. Number 9, I have Keyflow. This is essentially a version of Keyflower, a famous game from Richard Breese. This has some co-designers with it. And it's essentially a re-implementation of that game. A lot of the iconography, a lot of the scoring conditions and so on are the same. But instead of that game's auction mechanism, which was pretty unique, it had players placing pawns, and you use a color of pawn on a tile, and that sets the pawn color for all players. Instead of doing that, players are simply doing Seven Wonders style drafting to build their display or to activate the various buildings in the display of them or their neighbors. Interesting thing is that when you're playing, you could only interact with your immediate left and right neighbors, so that's again kind of like Seven Wonders, and so you're always going to be worried about what they're building on either side of you, because that might be your only way to get a given resource that you need to score. What this does do, which is fantastic, is it takes Keyflower and makes it, again, to me, a more viable game for 5 or 6 players. Keyflower at that player count, tends to last, again, like 3 hours, which to me overstays its welcome. Here, because of the simultaneous drafting, simultaneous playing, and the need to only worry about your immediate neighbors when you're considering your moves, it means that it's going to play roughly as quickly at 3 players as it will at 6 players. So it's a game that I think I would prefer to play to Keyflower at those higher player counts. Keyflower I think is fine, I like it, but I also like to keep it at a lower player count. This solves that problem. and sacrifices very little in the process. The drafting works very well. It's very obvious how it works. If any players have played Seven Wonders, they'll almost immediately get it. If they played Seven Wonders in Keyflower, you're 90% of the way there to the rules explanation. So it's really smoothly designed game, almost like a refinement of what was there before. And I don't think it loses that much in the translation from being an auction game to being a drafting game. If anything, it makes it a friendlier, more enjoyable game for me. Although I could see some people saying that the hoarding of the meeples and the way the bidding works, it's cutthroat, but it's strategic. So I could see why some people might prefer that. I tend to prefer the nicer game, and when given that choice. So that's my take on Key Flow. So let's see, at number 8, I notice I have cheated somewhat. I have a dual listing, and that is a listing of Lost Cities to Go and Lost Cities Rivals. And these are both essentially re-implementations of Lost Cities, which has been iterated on at least probably close to 15 times at this point. And this is a Reiner Knizia game. I believe anybody watching this video would know what that is. It's a game where you're trying to play numbers in either ascending or descending order, depending on which variation you're playing. And these two games, the Lost Cities to Go and Lost Cities Arrival, are both small box games that just tweak that basic core to various rule sets. So the Lost Cities to Go is almost a re-implementation of there was a Keltis not tile-line game, it was a Keltis card game. And it's almost a re-implementation of that. It was actually the tile-laying game, the Keltis tile-laying game. They've re-implemented it to Lost Cities to Go, except now it only plays 2 players, but it's added some interesting special effects tiles. So that's a game that I love. That's one of my preferred fillers. I always, or almost always, have in my game bag. It's Keltis. I forget what the subtitle is, but it's very quick distillation of that into like a 15-20 minute game. This one works the same. It only plays 2 players, but it adds some special tiles that I wish were in the other one. Because that one plays 4 player and this one only plays 2 player, I think I need to keep both. But if those special tiles were in the 4 player game, I guess I wouldn't have need for this. But they're really cool. They really mix up the hand management aspect of what to me is maybe the best hand management game of all. That's core Lost Cities. And again, it works in a 15-minute filler. Really great 2-player game. I think it's about as good as the normal Lost Cities. I'd happily play it, or as happily play it as I would the normal game. The Lost Cities Rivals is almost an auction game, and that almost works like it's almost a melding of Lost Cities with something like Raw, where players could either draw and add to a pool or call an auction. And it's a multiplayer game. I believe it plays up to 4. And players are going to be essentially auctioning off a pool of cards that are in the middle to be added to their tableaus, so Lost City styles. You could discard one out, so you might win an auction just so a player can't get a card. And then there's pretty typical Lost City scoring, although I guess it's based on the number of symbols on the cards as opposed to the strict number on the cards. But in any case, if you've played Lost Cities, a lot of it will come naturally, but it adds an auction element to get those cards, which is interesting because it reduces the amount of luck. Although the auction is a little bit simple, it's just I believe it's, I forget if it's once a round or not, actually, so I probably should have looked at that again before I've done it, but I've really enjoyed the game. I believe it's once a round, which kind of sometimes leads to situations where people hoard out money because it's a closed economy, and then could do 1 or 2 big buys. So it's a game that I haven't yet come to terms with strategically, but that's to me a plus. It is an enjoyable game in its own right, worthy successor again to Lost Cities. If I was going to pick just one of these two, with the caveat that it's only 2 players, I'd probably prefer the Lost Cities to Go, but a Knizia auction game is always a good thing, so Lost Cities Rivals, also a good game. So moving on, number 7, we have Container, the 10th Anniversary Jumbo Edition. This is mostly a reprinting of Container, but it does have some significant rule changes, the way the banking market works. And this is a really intriguing game to watch play out. I'd only ever played the old Container maybe twice, and just reintroducing this to people over the last year has been really enjoyable. Just watching people get that light bulb moment when they realize how the things that they put up for sale aren't going to go directly into, or the things that they acquire aren't going to go directly into their own collection of various containers. So this is a game about shipping containers, and you have to buy sets of containers, then put them on sale, then other players could get them and cycle them back through the market, and then hopefully you'll eventually get them onto your boat so you could send them to a central island for scoring. And it has all these interesting rules about the way that these containers flow in and out of players' control, the ways that the auctions work. Players are going to get huge windfalls of cash, but sometimes it's worth foregoing that windfall of cash just to get that thing and pay full value for it yourself. So it has all these really terrific player interactions. It's still, I guess it's 10th anniversary, 10 years later. It's a very unique game. There's nothing quite like it. The new production's absolutely fantastic. It's an extremely heavy box. It cost a lot, but it was worth it for me. I've it's, you pay for the weight, I suppose, but it's a really good implementation of it. Again, they did change some of the minor rules for it. And I almost mentioned, I think the same publisher also did a re-implementation of Neue Heimat, which is another good auction game that came out, maybe 10 years ago or so, and I believe they also republished that this year as The Estates. That's a game that I like a lot. I just haven't actually played the re-implementation of it because I have the old version, so it's not on my list, but that would be another one that I really recommend. These are both very, thinky auction games, so you kind of know if that's your forte or not. That is to my taste. I like both of those games. Very happy to have finally a copy of Container. For years it was extremely expensive, but without great production because it was out of print. So really terrific to have it back in production. So that's the 10th anniversary edition of Container at number 7. So moving on, my number 6 re-implementation is a game by the name of New Frontiers, and this is essentially the board game version of Race for the Galaxy, which oddly started as, I believe, a board game version of Puerto Rico. So this is not just a circle back to Puerto Rico. It is essentially almost more like the Race for the Galaxy dice game, Roll for the Galaxy, than it is like Puerto Rico. And essentially what it does is it distills Race for the Galaxy, which is one of the great tableau building card games, into, I will say, a slightly longer game, but also one that's more strategic, because instead of being at the luck of the draw hoping that you get a given card to launch your combo into action, at the start of the game, the technology tiles that are available will all be available for all players, and there's a limited quantity of that, fewer than the number of players. And the endgame scoring tiles that are going to be available are all going to be available to all players. And other, so that just shifts it from being, a tactical game into being more of a strategic game. To me, that's awesome. I really think that this is probably something that I'm not going to want to play Roll for the Galaxy anymore, because it takes that dice element out of it and replaces it with just raw action selection. So just picking your action, having it affect all players, and then using that optimization selection, or the optimization of that selection mechanism to build your engine. Trying to pick things when they're disadvantageous for other players is the core of the game, and it's really emphasized here because those elements of luck, whether it's the card draw or the rolling of the dice, are taken out of the pictures. So this I've only played this, it's only come out in the last couple weeks. I've only played it a half dozen times already, so that's good, but at the same time I'm not sure of the legs of it yet. I may be underrating this as it is, but to me, it's probably, or has the potential to be my favorite version of this Race for the Galaxy game. So, one that I'm looking forward to playing a lot in 2019. Moving on, number 5 is Northern Pacific, and this is a reprint of an old Winsome game, and I'm forgetting off the top of my head what the name of that Winsome game was, but it's a straight reprint done by Rio Grande now, as they often do. So it's a train game, but it's really a distillation of a train game and a stock market game into almost its purest form. It's a game that plays over 3 rounds in about 20-25 minutes. So each round is less than 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes per round, and it's almost a game that rewards or that emphasizes the shared incentive structure in a lot of stock market games, and also the the cutthroat route building in 18xx games and your Steam games, and knocks it down to almost an abstract form. And to me, it's absolutely terrific. All that you can do on your turn is place a investment cube in a city, or extend a train. And the train is going to always just go from, one city, I think Baltimore, to Seattle or something like that. And it'll always go westward. It'll never double back. So it has to follow preset paths on the board. So these paths are going to hit various cities. If the train stops at a city, all the cubes that are there are going to pay out to players. So they'll get their cube back, plus they'll get extra cubes, depending on the size of the cube that they place there. And if the train goes past the city, it'll never pay out. And eventually it will make its way to Seattle. You'll count up how many cubes you have. Whoever has the most cubes, wins the round, but you play over a few rounds, so the incentives to keep players from scoring will shift over the course of the round, or over the course of the 3 rounds, rather. And this is such a simple design, yet at the same time it's one that makes you pay extreme attention to turn order. Essentially, you put players in positions where if they don't force a move, or if they don't take the move that you're forcing, the next player is going to foil it. And it's almost like you're playing turn order more than anything else. And it's almost works almost as a thought experiment in its way. Yet at the same time, it's very recognizably a stock game with shared incentives, and I've really enjoyed it. It's one that I think, for a filler, it plays unlike most fillers. It's not a lucky game. It's not a game that that requires much explanation, but it's one that you really are interacting with the other players, really paying attention to what they're doing. Other Winsome games have tried this, something like Paris Connection, and I think that this is even further a distillation of that. It's such a clean, well-designed abstraction of the train game genre. So if you like train games, or even if you don't, it's one that I think that every player should try. And I get that not everybody will respond to it, and not every player will see every consequence of every possible action that you could be taking, and I get that, and this game kind of requires that. Yet at the same time, for me, it's something that I've really enjoyed. I almost marvel at the simplicity of it. So it's a game that I really responded to, and that is Northern Pacific. So moving on, here's another 2017 game that I didn't play till 2018. I believe it wasn't released in the US till 2018. And that is Gaia Project, and this is a re-implementation of Terra Mystica. Essentially, it's just Terra Mystica in space. Not generally a super heavy gamer. This is on the extreme end of what I would consider playing, but I've enjoyed my plays of this. This is, like I said, it's essentially Terra Mystica in space. I feel like most people know what this game is. It's just an extremely well-designed version of that irons out some of the bugs that were in Terra Mystica. For example, the turn order seems very balanced. It's fun getting picking a race, trying to figure out how to best exploit that. These games sometimes, I feel like this genre where you get radically different starting powers, maybe not my favorite thing, because I feel like a lot of your moves end up being very prescribed from the start of the game. If I have this race that's really good at settling on planets, I'm going to be doing a lot of settling on planets. Maybe not the deepest strategic decision to get to that point where you realize that's what you have to do. But, this is at its core an optimization game. So within those constraints, gaining those points, I get that. But, despite that, my general aversion to that kind of game that prescribes you along a set path because of your race, I still really enjoy this game. So it's one that I've probably played upwards of 10 times, maybe more, over the last year or so, and it's one that I'm, eager to keep playing. I know that there's another expansion coming out for Terra Mystica down the road, but I have to say that I haven't played Terra Mystica since this came out. So, if we're talking about a list of the best re-implementations of the year, or last year, as the case may be, this is one of them. So, moving on to number 3, I have a game by the name of Axio, and again, this technically might be a 2017 game. I didn't play it till 2018, and this is a re-implementation of Reiner Knizia's Ingenious, which is one of my all-time favorite games. It's that's an abstract tiling game where players are trying to essentially create lines of colors to score. Essentially, when you lay down a hex tile in that game, you'll score all of the adjacent hex tiles of the same color going down a line. This game essentially takes those hexes, turns them into squares, which sounds like it's a reduction in complexity, but it's still a very fun game. It's a game where it has a traditional Knizia scoring where you're only scoring full sets of colors points that you have. So if you have your lowest score is 5, and you have the others all up at 30, which I don't think is possible. But, if you have all of the others at, let's say, 18, you'll only score 5 points. So you only score the full sets. That's, I think, one of the classic Knizia scoring examples. And this is just a re-implementation of that 2 squares, but it also adds a really interesting rule where you get to set down pyramids into one. Since it's squares, you'll have often situations on the board where you have areas that are just 1 square big, and you have, I keep saying squares, but you have rectangular tiles that are 2 squares wide, so like dominoes. So if you create an area that just has 1 area where no two square tile can fit, you get to place down a pyramid and square the adjacent things. That rule really opens up the game, adds new ways to score. To me, it feels like an improvement on what's one of my favorite games, Ingenious. So that's why it's so high up on the list. It's one that I don't believe has come out in the U.S., but it's language independent. One that I highly recommend importing, or just get Ingenious. I don't think you can go wrong with either one. They're pretty much neck and neck, and I'm happy to play either. They're both amazing games. Number 3, that is Axio. Number 2 is another Knizia game. He's certainly good at re-implementing his old designs, and this is Yellow and Yangtze. This is essentially a reworking of Tigris and Euphrates. And actually now this just occurred to me, whereas Axio was a transposition from a hex to a rectangle for Ingenious, Yellow and Yangtze is a re-implementation from a rectangle to a hex for Tigris and Euphrates. So I don't know. I guess that's these games, they write themselves. But no, this is an absolutely fantastic game. To me, it probably edges out Tigris and Euphrates, which is one of the all-time great games in many people's views. But what it does is it cleans up a lot of the rules confusion that existed in Tigris and Euphrates. It makes it a more fluid and more volatile game, and it changes the way that the scoring works in a way that makes huge bombardments of points happen less often. The way that I believe they called it internal conflict and external conflict. I believe the external conflict in Tigris and Euphrates could sometimes result in you getting a huge number of points because you eliminated a lot of tiles. That's reduced, so it does make the game feel more balanced to me. And also the way that this one uses they were monuments, now they're called pagodas in this version. It changes out how those score so that they're going to be changing around on the board more often. It's a lot more fluid as a result, and it seems like a more dynamic, more enjoyable game to me. Again, it's like the Ingenious re-implementation. This is just starting from such a high level that it didn't take a lot for it to be great, and it is. Knizia did not mess it up in either case. Absolutely superb game. Like I said at the start of this talk, the last 5 or 6 games, or the top 5 or 6 games on this list would be in my top 10 if I just did a straight up top 10. These are all amazing games as far as I'm concerned. So calling them re-implementations is absolutely not trying to be shady in any regard. So that's number 2, Yellow and Yangtze. Alright, and finally my number 1 re-implementation, and I realize I'm being verbose and I apologize. But my number 1 re-implementation of 2018, I think this is almost a consensus choice, and that is Brass Birmingham, which is again, a super heavy game, economic game, card driven to an extent, I guess. Most actions don't require cards, but it's a game that Martin Wallace designed. It's venerable. It's maybe 10, 15 years, something like that. And this is a lavish reproduction of it. I actually kind of prefer the old art to the art in this one, but this one has some rule change. The Birmingham map specifically has some rule changes. For example, requiring beer, which is an abstraction of workers, to do shipments. Also cleans up a lot of the weird niggly rules that were in the old version of Brass, and it's just a absolutely pleasurable experience. And part of that's just because it's just great to get Brass to the table again this year. I mean, that's a game that I really did enjoy in its old form. Although I think I kind of liked Age of Industry because it smoothed out some of the weird rules that existed in Brass more. But this one almost is the best of both worlds between the old version of Brass and the smoother rules of Age of Industry. This is now a smoother version of Brass, essentially. So it's a really a win-win situation. Absolutely, gorgeous production, except maybe the board is too dark, even on the daytime side for me. I find it somewhat illegible, but it adds player boards, which again is an improvement that Age of Industry had, so it brings that in, makes that a lot more user-friendly, easier to explain. And it's just, an extremely well-designed game, has a variable map, again, another Age of Industry thing that they've brought in that seems like an improvement. So it's really just Brass with all the good things from Age of Industry added in. It's, absolutely stellar game. It would be my #1 game for the year, but like I said, I think that it's fair to focus that honor on the newer games, or the fully new games, as opposed to the ones that just recycle the old. So that brings me to the end of my reimplementations list. I dread to look at how much time I've been spent talking about that. So, okay, so moving on to my actual top 15 list. Maybe I should have kept this at 10. Although, I do have a few games that just narrowly missed the list, so I'll just kind of rattle those off. So before I begin, I'll just mention that I really enjoyed these games. First one is Architects of the West Kingdom. This is a worker placement game where you're going to build up workers on spaces to make actions more and more powerful, but players should come in there and steal those workers and sell them back to a prison. So it has this really interesting interactive component that a lot of worker placement games don't have. And there's no blocking in it, which is great, so it doesn't rely on that crutch for the interaction. It just uses the player interaction to create the interaction. How powerful are players going to let you get a certain action to be before they step in and cut you off and make you start from scratch? Really fun little game, flows smoothly, multiple paths to victory. You could be good or you could be evil. I've seen players win doing both. Just a game that I think is well designed. Gizmos. This is almost feels a lot like Splendor. It's an engine building game, but one that's about that weight. It's a light to medium weight game. Uses marbles as your currency, which is cute, and it has nice clear iconography. Again, I've seen players try to rush the endgame scoring cards and do well, and I've seen players build a slow, deliberate, well-functioning engine and do well. So it's a game that seems to, for its 30-minute playtime, have a lot of strategic options, and it has really cute marbles. So it's a game that I think is a neat game. Gizmos, just off the list. Race to the Newfound Land is a Hansenblock published, essentially a worker placement game where you have various tiles that represent different power of workers that you could place. Another good game this year that I actually didn't put here, but I could have, is Bastille, which is another game that's almost like a lighter Lancaster, where you have different powered workers that you could power up over time. Flows very nicely, very well designed or developed game. Maybe a little simple for my taste, but it does work very well for what it is. Race for the Newfound Land also has these essentially ships that you're going to be buying, which will be give you different powers depending on what action they're going to be taking. Only plays over 4 rounds, and the first round takes like 2 minutes, and it's a game that by the end of by the start of the 4th round, you all of a sudden have a multitude of actions to be taking, and you're going to be worried about area control on the board. You're going to be making deliveries to complete contracts, doing all sorts of things. So it's a game that builds really beautifully from a very simple start. So Race to the Newfound Land, excellent game. Next one is Neom, which is a tile laying game. It's a city building game. It has 7 Wonders style drafting, but it has almost like a SimCity type scoring where you're going to be building out production areas, residential areas, commercial areas on a little map. So it has an enjoyable, multi or solitaire aspect where you're building, the best little route puzzle on your player board that you can, all the while you're drafting tiles, so you're worried about what people are going to be passing you, see if it fits into your city plans. Also has a thing which you're going to be looking at your neighbors to the left and right, kind of like Keyflow. Maybe I like Keyflow more than this, but it has this thing where you're paying attention to your neighbors, trying to buy resources that you need to build tiles off them. But in general, a very neat game. Iconography is a little bit dense for what it is. Not as bad as the Between Two Castles of Mad King Ludwig, which is just to me a nightmare for small tiny iconography that's hard to read. kind of sinks that game versus what could be. This one has slightly more legible and easy to parse iconography, so it works better, I believe. But, you know, a very similar game to that, one that just narrowly missed the list. Next one is Illusion. This is a 5-minute card game where players are going to be trying to decipher or guesstimate how much of a given color is on a card, which has a pattern with different colors on it. And it's just, you know, a simple 5-minute, 10-minute party game where players are going to be, you know, testing their perception. It is a game that's almost so simple that it, you know, seems like it shouldn't work, but it works really well. It's always funny how challenging those cards turn out to be. When you're trying to gauge a color, you think that there's, you know, only 5% on, there's 15%, you know, so you're way off. And often every player at the table will be way off. So it's just it lives up to its name, shows you how faulty your eyes are. It's just a game that generates a lot of laughs. Really good design. Two more honorable mentions. First one is Blocks. There were a lot of Tetris-inspired dice games and board games this year. This is, to me, the simplest, cleanest, and best of those. It's essentially from the designer of Carcassonne. You just roll dice, pick one. Other players will be able to draft that one, or, you know, the other one that you didn't pick. And what you're trying to do is just, you know, fill up your Tetris board. Empty spaces are negative points. If you manage to circle, some of the spaces on the dice will have circles on them. If you put a circle over a number, you'll get bonus points. Try to be the first to fill in given lines on the thing. It's just, you know, it takes 2 or 3 minutes to explain, 15 minutes to play. Gives everyone what they would expect from a Tetris board game, as opposed to some of the other ones that came out this year that kind of gild the lily a bit. Just a nice, clean design, really good filler. That is Blocks. It's BLOXX, exclamation point, I believe. And the last one of my honorable mentions is Gugong, which I believe was called Forbidden City, but now it's Gugong. And the Forbidden City is actually another game that came out this year. Tile-laying game, not the best game. Yeah, kind of ugly to look at, but interesting. But Gugong is from the designer of Hansa Teutonica, one of my favorite games. It is a worker placement game where you're going to be using your cards as workers, and you have to play generally a higher number onto a space than the previous card that's been played there. So it does have blocking in it, although there are ways to mitigate that. And it's a really good design. I like it a lot. I've only played it 3 times because the Kickstarter version did not yet reach my house. I was lucky to play it 3 times at a convention. But I'm starting. I like it a lot. It seems like a good design. I'm not sure how much longevity it has in it. A lot of these medium to heavyweight Euro games that are coming out lately, I feel like you know, have 10 or fewer plays in them, and that's maybe the, you know, a symptom of, you know, last 10 or so years of game design. You see everything that there is to see in a game after a few plays. So the only reason this isn't on my list, I think, is because the jury's still out on how much longevity it will have. So it's just narrowly missing my list. It feels like a good design. I like the ways that you interact in it, but it does feel like you're going to be doing most of the things that are in the game every time you play. So I'm not sure how much strategic variety there is in it. But well designed. Like it. Moving on. So finally, I am getting to my actual list of my top 15 original games of the year. And yeah, I will say that this is, yeah, I guess not every one of these is the most original game, and originality is not the key criterion that I was looking at when I was creating the list. These are just my favorite 15 games that aren't, you know, expansions or reprints or rethemings or what have you. So going on, number 15, it almost does seem like a retheming. It is Monara, or ReImplementation, and this is a game that is a dexterity game, a stacking game. It has a lot of similarities to an old stacking game by the name of Villa Paletti, but it crucially is a cooperative dexterity game. So it's a cooperative dexterity game where players are going to essentially be flipping over cards that are going to tell them certain short-term goals that they need to accomplish. You know, for example, like put two tokens from your area onto the board, and those tokens could go on certain colored discs on the the platters that you're laying out. So it's essentially a number of pillars with supports underneath them, and they'll stack those up over the course of the game. I'll put up a picture, but essentially you'll have to meet those requirements of the cards, and there's easy, medium, and hard requirements. So if you're in a position where you're going to be able to accomplish almost anything the game could throw at you, you might pick a hard one, but then you'll have to take a few easy ones just to get in a position where you have options in what you could place. And there's some swapping of the pieces that you have available with other players and so on. So it's a nice cooperative version of a dexterity game. And to me, that works really well. It's a great combination of strategy game plus dexterity game plus cooperation. Whereas a lot of those games, the thing falls, one person loses, it's over. Here you're all in it together. And I've had really good plays of this where actually I've had a funny play of it where we made a crucial move. We pulled it off. We were so happy we cheered, and immediately we knocked down the tower. So it's one of those games where that could happen, and it's memorable as a result. And also, it's just so idiosyncratic to just have a cooperative, a strategic dexterity game that I think it warrants placement on the list. I will say that my opinion of it improved over time, because when I first got the game, there's a rule in the rule book that says that essentially if you've met all these conditions, you've met a certain number of conditions based on the difficulty level, you can either play until you've gotten all the pieces on the tower, and then if you're still meeting those conditions, you win. But it also had this rule in there where if you knocked down a part of the tower, but enough was still standing for you to still meet those conditions, you would win. So this, being a gamer, this inevitably caused situations where we would deliberately knock down part of our tower, and we'd still have the rest standing, so we would win. And I saw on Board Game Geek that the designer said that that's rules you should play without. It just, you shouldn't intentionally go against the spirit of the game, knock down part of your tower, and then, still be a winner. So once you take that out of the equation, it becomes very difficult to win, actually. It really requires a steady hand to get all those pieces onto the tower so you could actually win. And that makes me like the game even more. So, it's one of those everybody should play at once games. That is Monara. So number 14 is a new acquisition, and one that I've played a few times, but jury's still a little bit out on it, but I've really enjoyed my plays of it, and that is Captains of the Gulf. This is a Spielworks published game, which usually they create, for me, heavy games, but this is a medium weight game. I think it's not especially complicated at all. And it's a pick up and deliver game in which players are going to be manning shipping boats, which are going to go out, capture fish, go back to port. So there's a couple ports on the board, a couple places where people can pick up fish of various types. I guess shrimp, technically, clams, crabs, not really fish. And then, return them back for sale, and then go back out and do that cycle again. So it's a very interactive pick up and deliver game, because you'll be racing to those fish, which could get depleted out and then take a while to repopulate. So there's a real race element in that. And what drives the entire game is a rondelle, where 3 of the actions are going to be out at sea actions, and then 3 of the actions are going to be back at port actions, which to me is a really great design decision, because those 3 actions are coupled next to each other, and in a game that's about essentially going out, getting fish, coming back, preparing for your next trip, going out. This cyclic nature of it makes a lot of sense for a game that has a rondelle as its core mechanism. And you could essentially just try to hoard money, since money is victory points at the end of the game, or you could upgrade your ship over the course of the game by buying things that let you pull in more fish at once, or licenses to actually get certain types of fish, or upgrades to the various bonuses that you get when you sell the fish, and things like that. So I've seen players do very well with very few upgrades, and just worry on getting out and getting back as many times as possible, since the number of times that you'll make a trip is going to be variable because of the way that the game timer works. And I've seen people really build super ships and go out and get huge hauls and come back, and it's interesting watching those dynamics play out. So the game has, which is surprising since it's such a it's a rondelle game, which makes you think that your actions are going to be really prescribed. It almost has an open-ended sandbox feel about how you're going to go out there and exploit the fish that are available. And the way that the fish refill is really cool, has like this kind of double rondelle for that, which determines where the fish are going to spawn, so it's almost like a random naturally occurring thing. And in general, I found a lot of things I've really enjoyed about the game. It's really thematic, and it's really been enjoyable the few times I've played it so far. So I'm looking forward to playing more of Captains of the Gulf. Moving on to number 13 is Coimbra, or I've heard it's also pronounced Coimbra, so I don't know, but I'll call it Coimbra and be ignorant until somebody, I'm sure, will correct me. And this is a game that's, again, I guess to a certain extent it falls into the same category as Gugong, where I feel like having played it, I've played it a few more times than that, but having played it like half dozen times or so, I've seen a lot of what it has to offer. And at the same time, I do really enjoy the game. So I'm always conflicted about putting games on there where you play them 10 times and you might feel like you've tried every strategy and whatnot. But this one I did put on there. If I knew that there was an expansion coming, I probably would have it ranked even higher, because it feels like a game that's crying out for an expansion, because it's a dice drafting game at its core, and you're using those dice to essentially buy a series of cards. All those cards are going to be largely the same from game to game, so there's only so much variation in what you're going to be able to get. Of course, other players are competing with you for the cards, so you're not going to get every card at the same time, so it's hard to have like a set strategy, yet at the same time you see what the strategic possibilities are in the game, which are collecting cards that score 4 cards, essentially moving out on a little board to get different bonuses, or going up on these like area majority tracks, which will give you points at the end of the game based on how far you've gone, and plus boost your income at the end of the round based on what color dice that you've drafted. So it has a lot of nicely interlocking mechanisms. It's a very clean design, very enjoyable, one that is a nice solid medium weight game that's doesn't overstay its welcome. Happy to keep playing it. Worried that I've seen what it has to offer, and hoping that there is an expansion for Coimbra or Coimbra. Forgive my pronunciation either way. Moving on, number 12, and this is a game that for me really came out of the blue. Is called Smartphone Inc. It's a game from a publisher that I wasn't familiar with, Russian publisher, and from a designer that I wasn't familiar with, and yet it's one that is probably my biggest surprise from this year's Essen games that I've played. Like I said, it came out of nowhere. It's a combination of an economic and area control game where players are going to be playing competing smartphone retailers who are trying to ship their phones to as many customers in as many markets as possible to get money. So it has this, I call it an economic game, but it's really not that strictly economic. You're going to be setting prices and then getting points based on how many phones you manage to sell, but it's not a mathy game, and I think that's really lovely about it. Like most economic games give people who don't love math a headache, whereas this I think is pretty approachable on those terms. It's not a mental exercise so much as a strategic exercise, because so much of the game is determined by by turn order, and turn order is going to be determined by setting your price. The lower your price, the quicker you're going to be able to act in the market, which could block players who have higher prices out. So whenever you're doing your price setting, you're going to always be concerned about, do I want to go first, or do I want to sell more per unit, or get more per unit that I sell? And so you're really looking at what other players are in the markets where you're in, and considering what they might be trying to do, if they're going to be trying to flood the market, or if they might be playing more conservatively and just trying to price their phones for more. And so it has this really interesting dynamic of doing that. And it's all driven by these two, I guess they look like phone screens, where you're going to be laying those in some configuration in front of you, essentially creating a grid pattern with them. And that's going to determine your actions for the round. So that's like an interesting puzzle in itself. You can never seem to get those in exactly the right configuration. So trying to optimize your best actions for the round is going to be determined by that. And then a lot of it is just bookkeeping until you just actually sell your phones. And where you're going to sell your phones is going to be dictated by price. People will only pay so much up for your phones. And then also the technologies that you've developed into your phone. So if your phone has 4G or Wi-Fi, certain customers will be willing to buy those, whereas if you don't have, for example, a GPS, you might miss out on customers that are in a region where you're selling your phones. So all these things really work very well together. The game flows very smoothly, and it's really enjoyable. Also has a really nice clean graphic design. There's divots in the board, so since you're putting cubes into boards to sell to customers, it's nice that those stay in place. And it's, like I said, it's really just a really cool design. You say economic game, you say area control, those things kind of suggest a level of abstraction that this kind of gets away from. It feels very logical that, you know, if you sell your phones to customers, they're not going to want other phones, right? Like, so the way that the things like the blocking work and the price setting and the technology developed, those all feel very intuitive, and I like a lot of this design, so that's why it's on my list. Smartphone Inc. at number 12. So let me just take a sip. And moving on, number 11 is Ganz Schön Clever. This is it's a Kennerspiel nominated dice game, which is surprising. To me, is not that complicated. I guess there's a little bit of rules overhead, but once you learn the game, it flows very well. It's just a maybe slightly amped up, you know, dice roll and write game. There's been tons of roll and write games over the last few years. This one stands out head and shoulders above most of them. And that's probably primarily because of two things. The first thing is the dice drafting mechanism. When you roll, there's dice in various colors. When you roll dice, if you take a die that's a higher value than other dice, so if, let's say you roll a 3 and there's 1s and 2s there, you have to set those aside, so those won't be available for your future rolls. So that's always a agonizing decision. And then the other thing that really sets the game apart is that you end up triggering off all these special effect combos, which will trigger off other ones, and each one of the little sections of your score sheet, and I'll put up a graphic, has a different mini game essentially associated with it, and trying to trigger those all off and get them all progressed far enough along that you'll score points at the end of the game for, you know, your lowest scoring category creates this interesting puzzle. And I know that a lot of people have played this game on, it has an app and it has a web version, and I tend not to like web versions or apps. I played this a little bit and it was interesting, but I feel like it really does shine as a multiplayer game in person, where you are considering which dice to draft based on what other people need, and if you could look at their score sheets and make decisions based on that, it adds another element to the strategy in the game. So it's a game that I think caught a lot of people off guard this year. In a year flooded with roll and writes, this is really stands head and shoulders above the bulk of them, if not all of them, and it's the reason why it's on my list. It's really terrific. Ganz schön clever. All right, so moving on, number 10. At number 10, I have a game that comes in a very small box. It is 1906 San Francisco, and despite its small box, it's actually a very fun, full-bodied game. It plays relatively quickly. Even with 4 players, you can play it in probably an hour without a problem. With 2 players, you could probably play in 30 to 40 minutes, I would say. And it's a worker placement game that's largely takes place on cards, and it's barely worse off for it. Essentially, you're going to lay out a number of cards which have a row of worker placement spaces on it, and usually the stronger actions are to the left and the weaker actions are to the right. So when you move your worker down to the next card, you're going to be picking an action which will also set your turn order for the next thing, because you're going to pick actions for the card following it from the right going back to the left. So the weaker actions will generally go first for the next card. So it essentially has this constant tension built into it. So you're doing all these small, simple actions to either collect money, to clear rubble out of the city, to collect building permits, or to build on the board, which again is made up of cards, which is nice because it does allow the game to be variable from game to game. But all these small actions will just essentially enable you to do that building out onto the board, and the reason why you're doing that is you're going to have secret gold cards and public gold cards, which are going to be the bulk of your points at the end of the game. So that is it's a game, like I said, it's a game that maybe the money tracking is a little bit clumsy with the thing that they give you to do that. You might want to just include some coins if you play that, but otherwise it's a game that, like I said, is no worse for wear for being in a small box like this big, and it's just overwhelmingly a very smooth, very strategic yet not rules complex game, and it's one that I've played 8 times or so at this mostly 2 player, and I've enjoyed it every time, and I'm happy to keep playing it. Not a lot of variety in it, but it's not a game I think that needs variety because there's just so much competition baked in to the action selection and the way that the map works. So really enjoyable game. I hope it gets wider distribution. I know that's available in Europe. 1906 San Francisco is the name, but I would encourage you to get a copy if you can. So moving on, number 9, I have at number 9 the Quacks of Quedlinburg, and this is actually the winner of the Kennerspiel de Jars, and it is a bag building push your luck game where players are going to be playing alchemists who are trying to brew potions to sell to people. So you're going to, over the course of the game, be putting chits into a bag, and each round you're going to just draw chits from your bag, which will give you special effects and also move you along this cauldron track, and those will, the further along that track you go, the better. But if you pull out too many white chips from your bag, then you bust and essentially lose an action for that round or lose points for that round, depending. And it's just a really unique game. It's a game that is at its core just a push your luck game, and it does last 45 minutes, which I get that's on the long side for a push your luck game, but it's so unique that I forgive it that. It does have, of course, like as its nature, some wild swings of luck that it can be hard to catch if somebody doesn't bust the entire game. Yet they get really lucky with their pulls. It can be hard to catch up to them, even though the game does have a catch-up mechanism in it. I wish it was stronger. Yet the novelty factor of it outweighs the problems that I have with it as a design. There's tons of variety in the box, so it has a magical theme. Like I said, you're brewing potions, and the various ingredients that you put in the bag will change from game to game. There's, I think, 4 variations for each of the different chits that you could put in the bag. So it's a game that is going to be different every time that you play it. Trying to figure out the good combos of ingredients that you want in your bag is always fun. Some of them will let you mitigate your luck of the draw, which is usually encouraged because that's so central to the nature of the game. But it's really enjoyable. Just the basic mechanism of pulling things from the bag and hoping you get lucky is really fun. One of the better games of the year. That's the Quacks of Quedlinburg. All right, moving on. Number 8. At number 8, I have Liftoff, and again, this is not yet published in English. I actually have an import German copy of it. It has some German language on it, so that might be a stumbling block for some, but it's coming out in the next few months, I believe, in the US, so worry not. And first and foremost, I'm usually not huge into game themes or hung up on graphic design, but this is a game that, to me has an exceptional graphic design. I really love the retro sci-fi look that this game has. It almost looks like the art in the Fallout video games. It has that same sort of like cheeky retro sci-fi look to it, and it works really well in this game that's about essentially the space race. Players are going to be playing various organizations that are trying to launch rockets into space for points. It's a Euro game at its heart, and it has this really interesting and smooth overlapping of mechanisms. There's card drafting, there's engine building, and there's tight money management. And those all work really well together to make every launch feel like a giant success. And it always has you, I think, juggling between your short-term windfalls, so you could get draft cards that just will give you a lot of money, but then you may not get an upgrade to your launch capabilities, which will limit what you could do in the future. So bouncing those two things off each other in the game is going to be a constant, and so it has this really good tension. Even though what you're trying to do is straightforward, you always want to launch a rocket every turn, at least one. The various ways that you could go about that are interesting, and I really like the design of the game. I really like how those various mechanisms overlap, and I like how it seems very viable to either do a lot of small launches with upgrade, or to try to barrel to the large launch and hope that you could get there by the end of the game and do well by doing that. There's a lot of clean design in it, and that's what I like. I think it hasn't gotten much buzz yet, probably because it's not in English, but it's one that I think will get buzz, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it on a lot of best of 2019 lists as a result. So one to look forward to, or one to try out if you have access to it. That is Liftoff. Number 7. At number 7, I have a game by Stefan Feld. It is Forum Trajanum, and this is a heavier game by his standards, I guess. Yet at the same time, it seems really convoluted the first time you play it, and as you're saying through a rules explanation. But after you've played it maybe once or twice, it's no more complex than something like Castles of Burgundy. So it's a medium, maybe a medium-heavy game, but it doesn't seem that convoluted to me now that I've played it several times. And it's this is essentially, its theme is control, I guess, glory in Rome, who knows. But what you're actually doing is two-tiered. It's a puzzle on your own player board where you're trying to create spaces to build buildings to score points, maybe hit certain configurations are going to be on those scoring cards that are coming up at the end of every round. And then there's also a communal building area in the center of the board where you're trying to muscle people out to try to get large groups of your workers together on that board. And the game is for a game that's this strategic, there's a lot of luck in it. Each turn you're going to essentially be dictated by cards. Draw one from this row, maybe one from this column, tiles to clear up the spaces on your board, and those will give you certain resources. And this game always has tight resources. No matter what you draw, you're always going to feel like you're lacking something, and you're going to pass one of those resources to your neighbor. So there's this interactive element. You're always feeding one of your neighbors things, and you could kind of keep them from getting things that that they need if you're paying a lot of attention. So there's several elements of like high luck baked into it, yet at the same time you're usually able to overcome that and feel that you've accomplished your goals. And the game just it's an interesting puzzle because you're always being torn in a lot of directions. You want to maximize points on your board, you don't want to let people run away with the center board, and it's one of only Feld does this, I think, as well as he does, where he mashes together these completely disparate elements into something that just has all these interesting consequences across the game. Just removing this tile on your board will will give you a power that lets you do something out on the center board or whatever, and it all just works very well together. He's somebody who just rarely releases a game that doesn't feel very well developed. This is no exception. It's one that I think will be considered, I think, in his top tier of games going forward, and that is Forum Trajanum. Alright, now for something completely different. At number 6, I have a party game by the name of Just One, and this is an extremely simple game. And I should say that, like, the first time I played it, I actually played it at a party with more players than what was intended. We used our telestrations pads to do it. So it doesn't have any real unique components practically, but it's a cooperative game where players are going to be essentially trying to guess a word. One player will be trying to guess a word. All other players will be giving that player clues to that word. They write their clues down in secret. So let's say the word is dog. People write down a word that makes that person think dog. Then before they reveal those clues to the person, they compare their clues. Any clues that overlap with another player are eliminated, potentially reducing the number of clues that person gets. So, and then if the person guesses the word, you get a point. If they don't guess the word, you lose a point. And you're going to play 13 cards, get the best score collectively out of 13. So why do I think this is such a good game? Quite a few things. So yeah, first of all, I would say this is probably my favorite party game since Codenames. It's just one that works very well. I think that's a strength that's cooperative. And it's a strength that the scoring is almost incidental, like in most party games. This doesn't try to to dress up, the pig, so to speak. It knows that you're more worried about interacting with other players. The fun parts of the game are where somebody guesses a clue that is very obscure, or they do it after several things have been eliminated and everybody's grown because several clues got knocked out at once. And it understands that those are the moments that you play a party game for. I think that what's also great about it is that I literally just explained almost all of the rules right there, and it as a result it has such a low barrier to entry. Almost anybody could play. Yet at the same time, it has room to both reward people who are going to be creative and give you like out of the box clues, which give you the risk of throwing the player completely off the mark. But it also rewards the people who are going to be daring and actually give the very obvious clue at the risk that it's going to get eliminated by another player. So all of this stuff, it's just such a clean, simple design, one that immediately engages players, one that, every time I've played it, we've played, back-to-back rounds of it as a result of it being so fun and, people enjoying it. And also as a result of it being cooperative, where you're just, as a group, trying to beat your score. So it's not, everybody feels like part of the group, everybody feels like, they're contributing, which is, perfect for a party atmosphere. So it's, to me, a really amazing, brilliant design. Amazing largely because you can't believe nobody's done it before, but one of the best games of the year, just one. Alright, last 5. So at number 5, I have a more traditional Euro game, and that is Crown of Amara. And this is a game that is essentially just, on its face, a pretty simple resource collection and conversion game, where you're going to be trying to complete, I guess, turn in resources for points, collect things, in sets for points, recruit special powers to make that conversion process easier, build up your network or your engine so that when you go to a space to collect resources, you get more resources. So it's all very boilerplate things at its core. Yet at the same time, it just seems to be so cleanly designed that I've enjoyed it every time I've played it. I've played it, more than 6 or 7 times, maybe 6 or 7 times at this point. And despite the fact that it's so, like the fundamental thing is you have 2 workers going on 2 separate rondels. So there's 2 boards, and the workers are always going to go clockwise. And each round, one of them is going to move 1 space, one of them is going to move 2 spaces, one of them will move 3 spaces. And you'll activate those spaces by playing a card into them, which will give you some sort of bonus. So trying to figure out what order you should play those cards in to activate those guys, which guy you should move 2 spaces, which you should move 3 spaces, just making essentially this puzzle into an efficiency engine. It just works really well, and it's really rewarding when you make things fired off. It seems like the first time I played it, I was like, oh, this is a game that I really like, but I'm worried that there's not going to be the variety in it. And this is a consistent gripe that I always have for these Euro games. I think I've said this repeatedly on this video, but having that issue of, is this going to be replayable, 5 times from now comes up. But this actually has some nice variations built into it. You could play that you get all of your cards at the start, which makes it more strategic, might add to AP, and then you go through it, as opposed to generally you'll get 3 cards to go with your 3 spaces each round and draw 3 more. So that's one thing that you could do to spice it up. You can also essentially mix those 2 rondels. So in the default setup, there's one rondel that just lets you collect the 4 different types of resources in the game, and there's one rondel that essentially lets you go to a space to turn in resources for points, broadly speaking. And you could mix and match those, and then all of a sudden, you can't just guarantee to get resources every time you move. So it takes more forward planning. It becomes a much more strategic game just by mixing up those 2 sets of boards. And then the special powers that you could get, those will change from game to game. There's a certain number of characters that come out at the start of the game, and those will have powers. Those will be set essentially for the game. And then the ones that come out after that will just change the number of points. And that actually brings me to another really good thing that I like about the game that adds to the variety. At the end of the game, it has a Knizia type scoring where you have 2 types of points, and you're lower of the 2 types of points at the end of the game. So it's people points and house points. If you have 40 people points, 45 house points, your score's 40. what's interesting is at the start of the game, you're going to start with a certain number of house points, and it's based on the event card that comes out, which one will come out every round. But on the event card, it'll have a number on it, so like might say 20, might say 40, and if your house points start at 20, you're going to need to prioritize the sources of income that give you house points in a way that you won't have to do if your house points start up in the 40s. So that could drastically change the game from the nature of the game from game to game. So again, that also adds replay. So it's one that I've played enough that I see that it's straightforward enough, and yet at the same time gives you an open way to accomplish what are pretty simple goals, which is really just driving up these 2-point tracks. And it's just a super clean design. Always a lot to think about. One that I feel like it's going to have legs going forward. That's why I have it at number 5 on my list. That's Crown of Amara. Alright, at number 4 I have a heavier game. That is Underwater Cities. This is, to me, the cure for, or the replacement of Terraforming Mars. I know that there are a huge number of fans of that game. I think it's in the top 10 at BGG. I know that it's a beloved game. For me, Terraforming Mars was always best as a 2-player game. I'm not a big fan of the take that cards in it. In a 2-player game, those aren't really take that cards. Those are just, advance yourself at the only other player's expense. I also think that a 2-player game, you get more time to build your engine, and I've played that at 5. The game could just suddenly end. You don't get as much time to exploit the cards that you've spent all the game getting out at a higher player count. So I've always liked that best of 2. And I feel like Underwater Cities has a lot of the feel of Terraforming Mars. You're going to be building out on a personal tableau a number of structures, which will give you points and resources over the course of the game. It does have a set number of rounds. That's, I guess, different. But it's also driven by cards, yet those cards are essentially workers in various colors. So there are 3 different colors of cards, which when you play them on a worker space, which matches the color of the card, you get the bonus action on the card. Otherwise, you just don't get the action on the card. So you're always trying to match up those, which sometimes might mean taking less than optimal moves. So this constant tension between trying to maximize your cards and your action spaces at the same time to get things built out. It's just a really well-designed game. I do wish the physical production of it was a little bit better. The player boards are just really thin paper. I know it's self-published essentially, but at the same time, like, the gameplay makes me overlook that. It's funny that I complained about Terraforming Mars being best of 2 because I feel like with 4 players, this one does run a little bit long for me. It could take 3.5 hours, I think, realistically, if you're playing with people who are not speedy. So that's maybe a problem, but it just has a really great feeling of engine building, of trying to maximize every action. Not the most interactive of games, although there's blocking on the worker placement spaces. Yet it's a game that the cards are all very straightforward as to what they do. There's not a lot of rules exceptions caused by them, which to me is a huge plus. That's another thing that I would say Terraforming Mars falls flat on. So this is, to me, I get why people like Terraforming Mars when I played this game, even though it is not the same game. Don't get me wrong, it's not a re-implementation of that by any means, but it makes me understand retrospectively what people saw in that, because I see a lot of the same strengths here, but here the game is actually super enjoyable for me. So that is Underwater Cities. So moving on, at number 3 I have a game that by all means I probably shouldn't like, but here it is, and that is The Mind. This is by Wolfgang Warsch, who's really been like an exceptional designer this year. He produced The Mind, he produced The Quacks of Quedlinburg, he produced Gone Strong Clever. All 3 of those are on my list. Illusion, just outside of my list. So really banner year for him. Awesome game. This is on its face, not something I would like. It's both a social deduction game because you're paying attention to social cues from other players, and it's a cooperative game. Those are 2 genres I don't typically like. And yet here, it works brilliantly. Essentially, if you haven't seen this in action, you by all means should, because it's certainly a game to experience. and you're just collectively as a group of players playing cards to the center of the table. You want them to go from low to high. The trick is that you can't talk to other players about what cards you have in your hand. So it's essentially about reading body language, about reading the amount of time that's elapsed between the last play and the next play, to try and get those cards out in sequential order. You play over levels, so you start with just one card in the first round, then the second round you get 2 cards, and so on, till you get like 10 or 12 cards, depending on the number of players at the end of the game. And you'd be absolutely stunned. It's just one of those like aha moments, I think, in gaming, where you get 8 cards out across 3 different players without making a mistake. It's retrospectively, you're like, how did we do that? How is that possible? Yet the game focuses you in on other players like few other games ever have, and to me that's an incredible strength. So yeah, it's just a game that, like, by all rights shouldn't be as entertaining as it is, shouldn't really work, yet it does. So it's absolutely genius for what it is. Downsides, of course, are that I think it's extremely group dependent. I've had it fall flat with people, or people just didn't get it, or seemingly didn't want to get it, who essentially threw the game. You know, if somebody's not on the same wavelength as other players, they're not going to be able to participate, and they'll bring the whole team down with them. So playing it with the right players is crucial. But you know, when you have the right players and when you pull off amazing plays, you know, getting the 54 down before the 55, before the 56, and it all works out, there's almost nothing like it. So also it has an amazing mode where, as if playing the cards collectively is not challenging enough, where you play the cards face down, and then you reveal them at the end of the round, and you see how you did, and you'd be stunned. I haven't won that mode yet, but you'd be stunned at how you're able to do that as a group. So it's just a game that's pleasurable to play repeatedly with the same group of people, and see how, as a group, you're able to do this, you know, absolutely insane activity together, which is, I think, what the hobby is about. You know, collectively agreeing to an arbitrary set of rules to do something inane, to make it fun for everybody, right? So that is number 3, the mind. All right, at number 2, I have Carpe Diem, which is another Stefan Feld game. And this is considerably lighter than his other game on my list, Forum Trojanum. And it's a game that is has a lot of the elements that you would expect from his games. It's a point salad scoring game where you're going to be scoring from various different things. All these different powers are going to trigger out, and then you're going to have to, you know, meet requirements on scoring cards. But it plays so smoothly, so enjoyably, that to me it's just, you know, one of his very best designs, maybe his best. I don't know. It just works so well. It's essentially it's a drafting game where players are going to have a 7-sided figure in the center, and you'll have a worker, which you'll move along lines in the circle to take tiles from these various bins. Then you add those to your player board, and you're trying to be completing various, you know, little fields and little buildings. When you do that, you'll get bonuses, and you'll draft, you know, usually I think it's played over 4 rounds, 7 tiles each round. You get some bonus tiles and whatnot, but essentially the game's just about drafting, you know, 30 tiles, give or take, onto your player board. And what you're trying to do on your player board is where most of the game is, even though you're very worried about what people might draft out from under you. So the game has always tension. Every single tile seems like a direct attack at you, even if players have no idea what's going on your board. But on your player board, you're trying to do various things. You're trying to complete buildings, which will give you one-off bonuses, or maybe points, or maybe, you know, advancement along a track that'll let you place first in the scoring round. Or you are trying to, your board is made up of a little grid. It'll have little arrows pointing with certain building types, and like if you build a building that goes across a given arrow, you'll get bonus points for doing that. So you're worrying about that, and, you know, getting scoring cards that reward you for having multiple of the same type of building. So there's all these various things that you're worried about. Yet at the same time, the game is almost like breezy. It's lighter than almost any Stefan Feld game. It's lighter than like something like Castles of Burgundy, but it just plays so smoothly. At the same time, it's agonizing. So it's really this, you know, interesting mix. And at the same time, it's this I think one of the things I like the best about it is it's one of those rare recent Euro games, I feel like, where you could just play horribly. I've seen people score 120 points. I've seen people score 40 points. And if you're just drafting tiles pretty willy-nilly, not worried about maximizing, you won't do well. And a player who's actually paying attention to those things will absolutely beat you. I was somewhat reticent to put this at number 2 on my list because it does have a relatively lackluster production. A lot of the colors of the building tiles look the same or similar to a lot of players. That's something that could have been easily remedied and they didn't. The tiles for the final round have a different color on the back, but it's very similar to the tiles for the rest of the game. These are obvious things that could have been fixed in the production, but they didn't do it. Yet at the same time, at the end of the day, if I'm thinking about what are my favorite games, what would I most like to play, this is high up there on the list. So for that sake, number 2 is Carpe Diem. And continuing this theme of just liking games in spite of themselves or in spite of their flaws, I'll come to my number 1, which is a game that I've seen get very little buzz, but I love it all the same, and that is Xcode. And this game is wild. To me, it plays almost like a cooperative version, a real-time cooperative version of Pit, the classic card game, which to me is one of the best games ever made. It's like, if I'm talking about games I played as a kid that I'd still happily play today, I think the top 2 are probably Liar's Dice and Pit. So, and that's, I came from a raucous family. We, yelled at each other while we were playing our games. We teased each other, and Pit was perfect for that. And Xcode takes that real-time yelling and communicating with people out of turn, no turn structure, that chaos, that organized chaos, and turns it into a cooperative optimization exercise among all players, which seems like such a adding chaos into just a simple task that you have to do as a group is just a recipe for fun for me. So Xcode is basically a game where players are going to be dealt number cards that have arrows on them. So certain ones can only be passed to the left, certain ones can only be passed to the right. And collectively, what players are going to be doing is playing those sets of those number cards onto what looks like a phone keypad. So there's the 1 through 0, and then a star and a star and a pound. And when you get a full set of those cards in your hand, you get to put those down on, like a 3. You put your 3 or 4 ones onto the 1. And you'll complete the ones, and then players have to cooperate to get all those cards, all those spaces, those 12 spaces on the phone pad filled up. If you do that within the time limit, you win. So it's pretty simple, but at the same time, because of the lack of turns, and because of the chaos in communication, and because of the cards having these passing restrictions, you end up with these hilarious moments where, for example, you have 2 6s. Somebody across the table has a 6 to you. It can only get passed to the left, but the player to their left only has cards that can be passed to the left. So they can't trade a card that gets passed to the right with a card that gets passed to the left. So it requires like a bucket brigade of people to get the card over to you. And those moments are just incredibly, for me, fun. I could 100% realize that this is not a game for everybody. Not everybody likes real-time games. Not everybody likes cooperative games. Not everybody likes, simple games. I tend not to like those things necessarily myself, but this just, for some reason, is probably the most fun that I've had playing a game this year. And to I guess, top it off, on top of that, it starts out relatively simple. You're just trying to get 3 cards of every card onto the display pad, and you collectively do that within your 3 minutes, and you win. But over the course of the game, you're going to, as you clear these training exercises, you'll eventually start unlocking extra exercises which give you more and more challenge over the course of the game. So all of a sudden you might need to, for example, play down those sets of numbered cards onto the board in a distinct order, or what have you. And the game just ramps up its challenge, keeps giving you harder and harder things to do, and it just gets crazier and crazier as a result. There are ways, to reset the timer, which require, holding off and essentially keeping a player out so they could just pounce in and reset the timer whenever, it needs to be reset. And all these things just conspire to make something that's, like, a lot like, a lot like Just One. It just makes every player who's playing engaged, even though it's a simple game at its core. It just there's no way to sit out and play this game, and I think that that's something I really value. So I feel like I've had games that run the gamut this year that something like the Mind or this or Just One or Minara. Those are all like games that in a year that was by and large a lot of boilerplate designs that I could completely respect, completely enjoy my time with, and then move on. Those are maybe the games that are going to give me memories going forward, and they may not be games that I want to play week in, week out, every time that I sit down to play board games. But those are going to be the games that I feel like connect me with people, make me happy to do this hobby, and show me something that's just a little bit different than what I've been used to in the last few years in the hobby. So I think that's the reason why I put this game, which is quirky and idiosyncratic, at my number 1 for the year. So that is Xcode. And with that all said, I feel like I've gone way too long. I apologize for being so verbose. But those are my top games of 2018. I guess I will just say I'll continue to do videos going forward into the next year. I tend to only do a video if a game doesn't have an explanation video on it. So I've done a lot of videos for older games that nobody ever bothered to do a video for, but as new games come out, people tend to hop on those pretty quickly. So only if I feel like I have something to contribute, if I feel a game has gotten a bum rap, or if I feel like a game just doesn't have a light being shined on it and it deserves it, will I probably do a video. And I'm pretty at ease with that. So hopefully what I'm doing is of value, and hopefully this list of probably 30 plus games has pushed you in a few directions you might not have otherwise gone in. Otherwise, I wish you the best for 2019, and thank you for watching.